Okay, so as I noted, we're going to be approaching topics in three topics in succession. We'll talk about two other dynamic modeling approaches. We'll talk about uh, trade-offs between or areas where they're each particularly well suited, particularly expressive, particularly well adapted. We'll then talk about hybrid models between the two. Um, and we'll then have a later module on multiple packages for agent-based modeling. Okay, so I emphasized in my opening lecture in this boot camp, uh, some shared features of dynamic models. Dynamic models are an clade where in common, they've more characteristics in common than the differences between them. Although we'll be talking about three different traditions here of dynamic modeling, it's important to recognize that they all share certain characteristics. Um, so they depict the behavior of a system over time. Um, there's routine application of all these types of models to nonlinear systems. And in this implication, you cannot simply derive exactly how the system will behave over time in general. In general, for nonlinear systems, you're going to have to simulate it step by step by step. And each of them characterizes some evolving state that changes according to some incremental change specified by the framework. How those different frameworks specify incremental change flows for the sake of system dynamic stock and flow models with state charts, say hazard rates associated with a state chart or delineation of it as being associated with a timeout of time, residence time in the source state, or the occurrence of a certain condition, or arrival of a moving agent at a destination, or arrival of a message is different. And for discrete event simulation, it will the next little incremental bit of change we specified by the workflow and the rules for resource dependence on the workflow. Dwell times and resource dependence are indicated in that framework. And depending on the availability of resources, an agent may be able to proceed where they otherwise wouldn't. So the point is that all of them specify some incremental change that can change the state of the system. So the current situation is changing over time in ways that depend on that situation. How it changes over the next little bit depends on the current situation. It is most emphatically not a situation where it changes in some fixed way over time, some invariant way, nor is it a situation where it just has randomness that's independent and identically distributed at all times in ways independent of model state. That would not be a dynamical system and it's not a dynamical model fitting use of dynamical models to describe a situation like that. Dynamical models describe dynamical systems where the current situation is evolving, what is the case is evolving, and how it evolves depends on that what is the case. What is the case now will dictate how things change. If there's nobody who is currently unafflicted by diabetes, nobody's going to develop diabetes. If there's not currently a susceptible and infected, nobody's going to get infected, etc. So all of these specify incremental changes that characterize how that state evolves. And then by playing out time, the system behavior is observant. And generally, these models will be, so generally these models will be nonlinear. They characterize nonlinear systems. So here's deterministic behavior independent of state. That's not a good application of a dynamic model where we have some fixed change over time, nor is stochastic behavior independent of state. Both of these are independent of state. That's not it's not something that requires a dynamical system and it's only an impoverished dynamical system, a trivial dynamical system they're describing. So we have some underlying coupled nonlinear dynamical system. We have some observations of scattered areas within it, and we have some associations that emerge from it. And I gave the analogy to Plato's cave. Okay. So, I've talked about model scope, et cetera, and some considerations here. I want to talk about, because we'll talk about three quite distinct traditions. Agent-based modeling we've already seen in spades. We're going to talk about stock and flow modeling, and more broadly system dynamics. Then we're going to talk about discrete event simulation. So within this context, I will just note that it's easy to get distracted by superficials or things that are, if not skin deep, only, still fairly, they're not fully deep. They're meso level considerations. And I would ask you to keep constantly in mind these are close cousins of each other, despite the appearance being very different. The building block, the visual representation of what a model looks like is going to be very different, but it belies the shared similarities. And I would say surface level from the standpoint of substantive, deeper differences. Surface level factors also include like software features, and right now, what the vocabulary is. The visual representation of that vocabulary and what is done visually versus in a read eval in a command line type way, a read eval printlet interactively like in a notebook. Those things will evolve. And over the course of my professional life, they've evolved dramatically. And we're hoping and we're continuing to drive evolution of that. A bit deeper is the formalisms, like the building blocks. And those building blocks differ a little bit from platform to platform, and a lot for agent-based modeling. The building blocks that are available are much less standardized. But generally, there's going to be certain building blocks that you use for each of the types of models, and certain building blocks you don't tend to use. What I want to emphasize that students often miss, and miss tragically or with great regret, is differences in the model purpose. These traditions are not vying to answer the same questions. They are not different approaches to characterize exactly the same modeling simulations to address the same research or practice problems. They are seeking generally to address different questions. They're seeking to realize different goals. The types of problems being addressed are quite different, and the types of framing reflect that. And the focus of the analysis, George Richardson, a prominent system dynamicist over decades, and someone who's contributed greatly to many aspects of the craft, including participatory modeling, a towering thinker, speaks about the very particular distance the system dynamics takes, which abstracts away from events and looks instead at dynamic patterns. Here, the model is not being used to try to depict, by and large, particular events and their occurrence. It's being used to sort of characterize patterns. So when you see these different traditions, at first glance, visually, they'll stand out, they'll look like solitudes, like totally different worlds. But please remember the common underlying approach, which makes them more similar than they would otherwise be. And remember that they're all brothers in arms in this goal of helping us characterize complex systems and reason about them. They share more than makes them dissimilar. They have more similarities than dissimilarities. But they're best used for certain types of problems, certain types of goals, certain types of circumstances. That is not that's a very important to realize. They're expressive. Each of them is exquisitely expressive. Just a wonderful tool in certain areas for addressing certain needs. And it's important to understand what those needs are and to not view them as simply, commodities that one is better than the other, one is more flexible than the other, one is primitive compared to the other. You'll find no shortage of partisans for one approach or the other who have virtually no lived experience with any of the other techniques, proudly crowing that their technique is the best and that the others are impoverished compared to it. And I cannot tell you the number of times I've encountered this in my professional career, and I've seen it from each of these traditions. And as speaking as someone who's applied both techniques extensively and to great insight, it troubles me to see people who lack lived experience, lack the authenticity of having used these techniques in a serious way, and diss other techniques. And I find almost always it's based on misunderstandings. It's based on assuming those techniques are aiming to do the same thing as your technique, or based on a superficial reading. So bear that in mind. There's no shortage of partisans yet. It was much worse when I wore younger man's shoes. And I have my share of scars from different communities that have viewed me as consorting too much with the wrong type of modeling. But these days, it's a more of a healthier environment, but you'll still find regressive voices of this sort who are close-minded in their experience and their thinking, trying to convince people that theirs is the tradition that should properly rule them all. So let's talk about the first of these alternative techniques, system dynamics. System dynamics is a technique that offers formalisms. It's a technique where those formalisms, both in their form, less widely known, has a mathematical description, but in their behavior that's induced or implied, that is most commonly used, has a certain form, the semantics. But more deeply, system dynamics carries, like the other techniques, it's kind of to draw on a slogan, a phrase that's often used in higher mathematics. System dynamics is a methodology with an attitude. And that's true for all of these traditions. They have formalisms, certain forms, certain syntactic rules for putting them together, how they can be arranged, and interpretations that are common, sometimes overly restrictive. But then they have an attitude about how they should be applied, when they should be applied. System dynamics has a very strong philosophy associated with it that focuses on feedbacks and accumulations. Okay? And it carries with it a methodology to help conceptualize, describe, analyze, and manage feedback-based systems, these systems based on feedbacks and accumulations. But fundamentally aims to shape mental models, aims to shape how stakeholders, how people think about a system, much more so than like discrete event simulation traditionally or agent-based modeling. It's really focused on the socio-technical context of modeling and shaping people's understanding and thinking. And to inform that enterprise, it makes use of qualitative and quantitative components. It really emphasizes incremental, iterative modeling that delivers ongoing value. I'm a huge proponent of that, in part because I've been impressed by the value of this tradition and recognize the utility and the excellent fit that it offers, the value that it offers. And I'm a big believer in particular agile modeling, so pursuing which involves some additional commitments. There are system dynamics prizes techniques for working with stakeholders and working within the human theater of modeling in a way that involves many parties. It has a rigorous mathematical foundation to it, traditionally grievously underexpressed for the form of models, although in the past, particularly the past 3-4 years, my group has been working with mathematicians to really provide that fully in place. But where it has a very widespread application is in the common use for stock and flow models of ordinary differential equations. Emphatically, those are not the only semantics for them, but they are the overwhelming semantics that's overwhelmingly most common. And we'll talk about that in a minute. It has, by virtue of using ordinary differential equations, a rich set of analysis approaches and quite sophisticated software that allows you to focus on the what is being described rather than on the details of how it is captured. And a central theme here, and this is really central to what models we build, how we build them, the tools for building them, the process by which we build them, that there's a attention to how most decisions are based on overly constricted or narrow mental models, or mental models that are otherwise flawed or blinded. And that policy resistance offers, it often reflects those narrow mental models. And system dynamics seeks to broaden people's mental models of an underlying system in important ways. And I think you saw in my earlier part of my when in my opening lecture, but then also in some examples during the week with agent-based modeling cases where our mental model really needed refinement, where we didn't realize that our model implied births and deaths in later generations that could come about because of the effects of anti-tobacco efforts. And when we were looking at the effects of those anti-tobacco efforts on deaths, we were also broadsided by the fact that it was the model results there reflected results for future generations. Now, within system dynamics, there's this broad adherence to this view of mental models as shaping how we engage with the world and how we understand phenomena in the world, and how simulation models serve as thinking tools. And you'll of course have heard that as a central theme, arguably the most prominent theme across this boot camp. How models are tools for thinking, not sort of technocratic instruments that serve as crystal balls for predicting what will happen, but tools for helping us. They're not depictions as a crystal ball of the truth of the situation and how it will evolve, but rather they are tools that speed us to the truth by helping us think more deeply, more robustly, more quickly, and more fully through the interpretation of data from the world and the consequences of our actions. So system dynamics really emphasizes feedbacks and accumulations. And you may find it strange if you don't have any exposure to control theory um, or systems in an engineering context. But one of the insights that really reached great prominence in the middle of the 20th century um, was just how much feedback, the occurrence of feedback within a system, shapes the system's behavior. In accumulations, cases where the system builds up, some quantity within the system builds up over time or decays only slowly, has huge impacts on delays, inertia, disequilibria behavior, cases where the system's out of balance. And system dynamics features on these two components with the reflection as well that it's by regulating feedbacks or by putting in place new feedbacks or blocking certain feedbacks, but certainly taking into account feedbacks, that we can better manage a system, make better decisions. And the idea here is that our cognitive limits are just not sufficient to allow us to do this in our head, and that's well established through experimental studies, as I've mentioned. And so we need to equip us. And this idea of a learning prosthesis is very, very aligned with this, with tools to help us think more deeply, more reliably. Complement our wetware, our mental models with tools that will help us spot their blind spots, and help correct our head off our cherished prejudices, and better ground our expectations of consequences. Much as a crutch helps us achieve near full mobility despite us having a broken leg, for example. So stakeholder participation here is seen as of great importance to the success of a modeling project, and the ability for stakeholders to engage with models is seen as very important. Models in system dynamics are also designed to directly enable formal reasoning and analysis. And the diagrams we use in system dynamics, whether causal loop diagrams, system structure diagrams, or stock and flow diagrams, help us reason about behavior visually and in terms of the diagram. Okay. I'm going to be commenting here mostly about use of system dynamics at an aggregate level, where it has greatest, which is the area where it's been most applied within public health and in health and healthcare. However, you should recognize that much of the hybrid modeling will apply at an individual level, not simply at an aggregate level, to characterize dynamics of continuous quantities. Now, I feel as if I'm droning on here, and I really want to get you in front of some diagrams, but I'm trying to set the stage for system dynamics, the priorities, goals, worldview of system dynamics, to really understand the diagrams that are coming up. And this will be the last slide before I dive into some of those diagrams. Because of this attention to participation, stakeholder participation, system dynamics has evolved a rich tradition of embracing stakeholders across interdisciplinary teams and from the community in modeling. In earlier generations, this was groundbreaking work was done by people like Jack Venix, by the Albany team with George Richardson and David Anderson, and there was great progress on using this in certain policy spheres like natural resources by Andy Ford at Washington State, and students like Allison Beal, Christina Stave, and others. More recent generations have seen some of my contemporaries like Peter Hoffman, very, very prominent, Etienne Rouet in Netherlands, as well as folks at a variety of locations in the US, really using participatory modeling, including at the community level. Um, and uh, and there are forms of system dynamics that really foster the form of system dynamics fosters this because it provides means of capturing qualitative as well as quantitative understanding, and it uses a declarative characterization of a simulation model that avoids anything close to what we commonly think of as programming in a way that's visually accessible and about which you can reason visually, reason about dynamics observed in the world and about causes of that dynamics in terms of the form of the model. And this is fairly independent of the, I will note, of the semantics of the model, whether you associate with the stochastic transition semantics or an ODE or ordinary differential equation semantics. Um, uh, it's an aspect of the form of the model that carries across to all of those semantics. And this ability to reason about models, to understand models, to contribute to models, to challenge models, critique models, help evolve models, both at a qualitative, quantitative level, can really support this sort of high stakeholder engagement in model and support model conceptualization, formulation, analysis. So the most basic form of this is in the form of causal loop diagrams. And causal loop diagrams employ a simple graph-based representation, shown here, depicting positive causality. So if we have an arrow from we'll call it a variable here, A, call it hunger, to another variable, B, call it food ingested, um, uh, I'll be with you just a second, Wade. Then uh, if we have an arrow from A to B associated with a plus arrow, it means that if hunger increases, food ingested will tend to decrease compared to the value, tend to increase compared to the value it otherwise would have had. It's a plus. If hunger goes up, you could think it formally, food ingested will tend to go up compared to the value. It'll be larger than it otherwise would have been. Okay. And if by contrast, there's an arrow from A to B, which is associated with a negative sign, say from food ingested to hunger, it would mean if food ingested goes up, hunger will tend to go down compared to the value it otherwise would have been. Yes, you're supposed to see a PowerPoint, right? That's what you're seeing, right?
We don't see it. That's what I was going to.
Yeah, now that you were saying A and B, I was wondering if there was a PowerPoint, but there's nothing shared.
Are
Sorry.
you are you serious? Oh,
Yes.
Yes.
oh my gosh. I've been going, yeah, in detail through slides here talking about the points I'm making. This is weird because okay, it's not responding to my share initially. Okay, now it's just done it. Oh, I feel terrible about that. Okay, thank you for
Now,
so you haven't seen these slides nor these slides before.
Nope, nothing. But it was pretty clear until the point where we were talking about A and B.
Okay, I'm terribly sorry. So let's reboot this and let's talk about an arrow from A to B here. Okay. Um, so an arrow from hunger to food ingested that's associated with a plus means if we have an arrow from A to B, so A here is hunger, B is food ingested, and it's associated with a plus arrow. If A goes up, say hunger, if here hunger goes up, it'll mean food ingested tends to go it tends to go up compared to the value it otherwise would have had if hunger hadn't gone up. So you could intuitively say if hunger goes up, food ingested goes up, but you have to be careful. Food ingested goes up compared to what it otherwise would have been, a counterfactual, what it would have been if hunger hadn't gone up. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going up over time, but it means it's bigger than it otherwise would have been. Okay. Um, um, and similarly, if there's an arrow from A to B, let's say here from A to B, we'll call it X to Y to avoid the confusion. Say X is food ingested, hunger is Y is hunger. It means if X goes up, Y will tend to go down compared to the value it otherwise would have held. And by implication, if food ingested goes down, hunger would tend to go up compared to the value it otherwise would have had. So it changes in the opposite direction if you compare it to the value it otherwise would have had. Sometimes we label plus as an S, same, meaning hunger goes up, that means food goes up compared to the value it would have had otherwise. And minus as an O, meaning opposite. If food goes up, food ingested goes up, hunger will tend to go down compared to the value it otherwise would have had. So with hunger, to be clear, if hunger dropped, food ingested would drop compared to the value it otherwise would have had. Hunger goes up, food ingested goes up. So this is kind of like a same connection, an opposite connection. As long as you keep in mind that the notion of same or opposite is relative to the value the target would have otherwise have had no change occurred. Okay, so this is called these links are called causal links, and this is an illustration of a feedback. They compose according to the rule of signs. So if you have successive links, a plus followed by a minus, it's of sign plus times minus, which is a minus. Okay, and that holds for longer paths in general. So causal diagrams provide us a way of characterizing in a very simple way a dynamic hypothesis about the linkages between different variables. Okay. When we have paths of these that form links, they fall into two broad categories with some subtypes. So some are what are called balancing loops or negative loops. This is an example of a balancing loop. It's a negative loop. But why is it a negative loop? Because if hunger goes up, then food ingested will tend to go up, which will in turn tend to decrease hunger compared to what it would have otherwise been. In other words, we'll push back on the original change. We raise hunger, we eat, it lowers our hunger. It's a self-stabilizing, it's a regulatory loop. It limits the change caused by the original push by the action undertaken. It pushes back against it. And there's many cases of this. Hopefully in life, we make mistakes, we learn from our mistakes, and that lowers our future mistakes. We regulate our behavior by realizing, oh, we can't do that. If I do that again, it'll be a problem. And we act in a more heedful fashion. Or, as Wade talked about, if the emergency department or an urgent care center queue size is too long, if there's too many people wait in line, probably people who are waiting there will leave, and that will lower the emergency queue size. It's a self-regulating process here. It's not to say that's always desirable. There are times where this is desirable, sometimes where it's not. But this is another example of a negative feedback, of a regulatory process or a balancing process. Here's another, right? Someone has a perceived level of risk. If that's greater than their sense of some appropriate level, they'll have some sense of surplus risk. That may lead them, if they have a sense the risk level is too high here, they'll take measures to lessen the risk of whatever sort. They'll lower the level of risk. And ultimately, that may contribute to a perceived level of risk. And then they may be able to relax. They've headed off some risks, and they'll be they'll feel a need to be less cautious. These are all examples of balancing loops. These feedback loops illustrate the situation where a change at one point, ripples through the system in ways that either push back against or amplify that original change. So it leads to this cascading series of changes across this path, which come back to the original one, either push back against it, that's negative loop, or amplify it, that's a positive loop. Okay. Now, one thing that may not be obvious, but comes out of some of the mathematics, if you start to think about it, analyze it in more detail, is that certain feedbacks tend to be associated with certain archetypical behavior, meaning that that from the structure, although it might look very qualitative, we can start to associate certain feedbacks with certain characteristics behavior. So if someone, initiates smoking with only the occasional cigarettes with their buddies, it grows that's something they increasingly look forward to. They maybe take some more cigarettes. They spend more time with those buddies smoking, in the smoking area, what have you, and that leads to a greater propensity to smoke. This is a reinforcing loop. A given change, like starting to accept the occasional off-proffered cigarette, leads to a ripple through set of changes that amplify that original change, that drive it further. I smoke, I'm even more likely to smoke, further drives my nicotine addiction. So this is a positive feedback. This is dysregulatory. It sort of drives off in a certain direction, right? Now, there are times where people seek this, right? Like if you're engaged in social marketing for health promotion campaigns, you may share a message on social media, it's picked up, and that leads to more sharing of the message, and you view this as a virtuous cycle, whereas this you might view as a vicious cycle. Excuse me, this plus should go around this way, not in other words, it would be drawn, it should look like this here. So this tends to be associated with divergent behavior, amplified behavior. It's like, putting a mic too close to a speaker, and it leads to positive feedback, right? Louder and louder squeals on the mic. Negative feedback, like we saw before with food and hunger, or like we see here with, vaccine complacency, tends to lead to stable behavior. It brings the system back into a balance of sorts. Whether that balance is desirable or not is another matter. But it tends to lead to the system to stabilize. So you may have based on the occurrence of outbreaks, you may find people are less complacent about measles in Alberta. That leads to that lower complacency coming about here may lead to more people being vaccinated, which lowers the number of susceptibles, which lowers the outbreak size and frequency. But by so doing, it may be out of sight, out of mind, and people fall back into vaccine complacency. And so you get a system where if it's perturbed, if it gets knocked out, it comes back into, a balance. This lies behind homeostasis, right? It lies behind thermoregulation, regulation of our salt levels, regulation of our food intake, regulation of our water intake, regulation of our sleep, etc., right? Now, the situation is a bit more textured than just these two types, negative and positive. We can sometimes have long delays when we lead to oscillatory behavior. Now, within causal diagramming, it's very rare that our system is characterized by one feedback. We generally have multiple feedbacks, and these feedbacks interact in very interesting ways often. So if we have a negative feedback combined with a positive feedback, we may get an S-shaped behavior where initially the positive feedback dominates, and then the negative feedback brings it more into balance. Maybe as we get more customers, we have more word of mouth sales, and that lowers the number of potential customers, which then the lower number of potential customers leads to less word of mouth sales, which leads to less rapid growth of customers. And it's very, very common that when we have multiple feedbacks next to each other, they lead to balancing, to interactions that lead to composite behavior that combine elements of shifting dominance from one loop to another. So I want to highlight here that this sort of modeling with feedback loops often leads into companies, and sometimes is conducted in continued parallel progress to quantitative system dynamics, which uses stock and flow models or compartmental models as shown here. Stocks here are the compartments. They represent the current state of the system, accumulations. So a set of people who are, post-attempt survivors of suicide attempts, forgive me for speaking about this, or people currently engaged in concrete planning, people who used to suffer from suicidal ideation, but now are ex-ideators, etc. People who have moved beyond the scourge of those thoughts. These can be measured at a single point in time, the state of the system. So to the degree we have the ability to observe this, which is commonly not the case, but to the degree we do, we can measure it at a single point in time rather than over time, at a single point in time. The number of people in the hospital is a stock. The number of people who are diabetic at a given time is a stock. We may not have ready estimates of it right now, population-wide, but in principle, we could observe it at a certain time. If we have a test, maybe it's an HbA1c test for diabetes, where if you're 6.5 or higher, you count as diabetics. Or maybe we assess it with an oral glucose tolerance test or a fasting blood glucose test. Whatever, the point is you can measure it at a certain time. Now, very importantly in stock and flow modeling, the value of a stock is specified at the initial time. Thereafter, the evolution of its value is dictated purely by the value of the flows. Okay, so if the flow out is greater than the flow in, the stock will go down. If the flow in is greater than the flow out, the stock will go up. Just like if water's coming into your bathtub faster than it's going out, the value of the stock will go up. Forgive me for mentioning it, but if water's coming into your toilet faster than it's going out, the level of the toilet will rise. By contrast, if these two are in balance, the value of the stock will be in balance. Okay. Here, while we lend initial values to these stocks, how they evolve subsequently is dictated by the flows. And this is true independent of the semantics we associate with this, whether it's a differential equation semantics or a stochastic transition semantics. So regardless of whether this is characterizing people going and dribs and drabs, stochastically transitioning across at specific points, or whether we view this as a number of people per unit time in a continuous flow, here we have a situation where if inflow is greater than outflow, in either case, the value of the stock will go up. The form of models seen quite a few times in the boot camp, and I think you'll recognize this. These are the stocks of a model for a susceptible, infectious, and temporally immune case. And stocks determine collectively the current state of the system. If you want to continue to simulate system evolution, all you need is one value for each of these stocks, and you fully specify the current state of the system. You could later plug those in and continue to run it forward because it's a complete description of the current state. Stocks are also really important for understanding disequilibria cases where the system isn't in balance, or inertia in the system, or memory in the system. And they give rise to delays. The fact that there's people in this state who have to lose immunity to become susceptible again, it leads there to be an amount of time between when people recover and when susceptibles build up, for example. So stocks give rise to delays. I said that in this context, stocks, the value of a stock is dictated purely by the value that flows into and out of it. And particularly it's dictated by the net value of those flows. The sum of those flows is really the operative quantity. All changes to stocks here occur via flows. But flows themselves are generally dependent on stocks, right? So the number of new infections within this model will in general depend on the number of susceptibles and the number of infectives. It takes two to tango. If there's not an infective, you could have all the susceptibles in the world and there won't be new infections. If there's lots of infectious people but no susceptibles, there won't be any state. The value of the flow in general will be driven by the values of stocks. But at a simpler level, the number of people recovering will be dependent on the number of infectious people, right? Depends on the state of the system. If there's nobody infectious, there's nobody that's going to recover. So flows depend on stocks. The evolution of stocks depends on the value that flows into and out of it, the net flow. But the value of the flows depends on the current state of the system. In contrast to stocks, which could be measured at a certain point in time, at any one point in time, you can figure how many people are in the emergency room, how many infants are there in Saskatoon, or what have you. Quantities, the flows have to be measured over time, right? Like, it doesn't make sense to say how many births are there in Saskatoon. You have to say, to answer that question, you have to say over some period of time, right? There are 10 births a day in Saskatoon, or there are 100 births a day. You have to say an amount over time, the amount that would have accumulated over that period of time, as it were. If you were to talk about number of babies, you could count the number of babies in Saskatoon in principle. But if you ask about the births of babies, that has to be quantified over time. The first is a stock, the number of babies. The second is a flow, the number of babies that are arriving. Same thing with, the number of people infectious and who right now who are infective or infected, we could go and measure in principle. With an appropriate test, we could go measure them. Not to say it would be logistically easy, but we could. But the number of new infections, it doesn't make sense to talk about, is the number of new infections large in some disembodied way? It's over some period of time. The number of new infections the past day, or number of new infections in the past week, over some period of time. So remember, so the flows here, I've said before, earlier in the boot camp, are like the verbs. The stocks are like the nouns. The verbs are where the action's at, but the verbs the values of them depend on the values of the stocks. The values that these take on depends how many people are in each stock. Right? So the stocks now determine the flows now, but the flows dictate the change, the evolution of the stocks over the next little bit. And if we have a stock and we have flows in and flows out, if the net flow is zero, the stock stays in balance. If the net flow is positive, that there's more flowing in per unit time than flowing out, regardless of whether it's stochastic transitions or continuous flow, the value of the stock will rise. And if it's more flowing out than in, if the bathtub is having water rush out of it faster than it's coming in, the value of it will drop. The value of the stock will drop, right? Heterogeneity can be captured in these models to a point via stratification. So we can divide up the population. If we wish to have a model that characterizes spread of infection in two communities among Canadian-born residents and foreign-born residents, we could subscript susceptibles by residency, place of origin, right? People, so that maybe the first group would be born in Canada of susceptibles. There'd be susceptibles born in Canada and susceptibles not born in Canada. Exposed born in Canada, exposed not born in Canada. Infectives born in Canada, infectives not born in Canada. And the susceptibles born in Canada would flow in, and when infected, into the exposed born in Canada. The susceptibles born elsewhere would flow into the exposed born elsewhere. So the model could be subscripted both in its stocks and flows, and indeed in many other quantities here, in a way that would allow it to characterize this heterogeneity, the fact that we actually have different populations. And in general, you could extend that to different age groups, 5-year age groups. You could have 17 subscripts, 0 to 4, 4 to 5 to 9, 10 to 14, 15 to 19, and so on up to 80 plus, right? By 17 age groups, we could have these. We could divide it. Now, here, because there's infection going on, we would have to take into account there's a mixing matrix, a contact matrix, by which someone from a given age group imposes risk on someone else. So suppose there's a adult 25 to 29 and a baby 0 and another separate baby 0 to 4. Another child in the 0 to 4 category. To what degree does that 25 to 29-year-old mix with 0 to 4-year-olds, right? Is an important question. Because if the 25 to 29-year-old is infected, to what degree do they impose risk on a 0 to 4 compared to others of their same age, say 25 to 29? So generally, if you subscript, you have to start considering like mixing matrices, contact matrices. And, there's a whole subscience as quantified by Anderson and May's book on infectious diseases of humans in its application to communicable disease modeling in a tradition that dates back to 1916 with the work of Ross, and then 1927 with Kermick and McKendrick and subsequent work. Where this starts to get so that even just with one subscript, it can get a bit complicated when we deal with mixing. And we get these kind of ungainly matrices, which often they need to be rebalanced to have the number of contacts from group A to group B equal to the number from B to A, etc. But where it becomes really problematic, where it becomes obscurant, where it starts to obscure the model structure, our ability to reason about the model, to understand it, to present it to stakeholders, which are at the core of much of system dynamics' goals and many modeling projects beyond now, Where it becomes really challenging and problematic is when you start to have more than one, and especially more than two subscripts. And this is the reality. I mean, we have HPV models that are subscripted by 5 quantities, right? Um, and it's not that unusual, right? You could have sexual risk category, you could have age, you can have sex, and income level or what have you, and very quickly the number of possible combinations it rises geometrically, right? If you have two, suppose you make it distinguish two immigration related groups, like we said, and then maybe you want to have 6 age groups. Now you have 2 times 6 different possibilities, number of susceptibles. If you have another one, so that's 12. If you have another that's divided into, let's say 10 deciles of income, then you go up to 120 different subscriptings of susceptible. And it becomes really ungainly. But more to the point, it becomes really mathematically intricate and it starts to become opaque. So you look at the formulas for these things and it's just dominated by obscuring details, welter of distracting details, especially when you start to deal with dynamics of aging together with the dynamics of evolution, potentially dynamics of, say, income or dynamics of people changing where they live. If you subscripted by city in which they live and you want to capture people moving between cities, it becomes incredibly obscuring. I speak with scars from authenticity of a lot of experience with that, and I could show interested people models if they were interested. Introducing a new type of heterogeneity in the population, differences between people, requires changes across the entire model structure, and it's a very big deal. So if you say, oh, well, maybe we want to take into account, something about someone's education status. We want to distinguish whether someone's a high school graduate or not. Um, uh, that would require massive changes across the model, where you have to be really, really careful how you extend things like the contact matrix, etc. And it bears noting that this strategy of subscripting does not, it only admits discrete categories. So in our agent-based models, for example, we had continuous quantities, right, for their current age, for example. And that was very convenient, right? We could summarize things, whatever fine-grained breakdown we wanted. We can impose hazard rates that change over the first few months of life, but then in middle years, only over course categories, and then again in fine years in the oldest age groups. We could have continuous geography, etc. Here, capturing that is not feasible. For those who are more mathematically familiar, you can go to partial differential equation models, but that's an area where there is huge specialization in types of partial differential equations, and it requires a whole nother level of mathematical skill and facility. Now, system dynamics models like the stock and flow models are outstanding for hiding some of the underlying mathematics, but there is outstanding resources if you're interested in turning these into differential equations. That is very, very routine. And you can basically transliterate a model like this into ordinary differential equations. Not everyone here is the background to want to go into this, but I will say that what happens is each of these states becomes state variables. The net flow into a state becomes the differential. So you'll have D exposed dt equals the formula for infection sub I minus the formulation for completing latency. And that will be an ordinary differential equation, which you can analyze. Will have initial conditions given by the initial number of people within these categories. And that can be readily analyzed to great effect. There's emergent behavior here that's very rich. It can include tipping points, lock-in effects, high-level behavior modes, and formal analysis of these. System dynamics community has contributed, and more broadly, the mathematical epidemiology and applied mathematics community have contributed very rich ways of analyzing the behavior of these models, demonstrating stability, demonstrating robustness, to perturbation, meaning like if someone infected with rubella flies into Saskatoon, to what degree will there be an outbreak and we can analyze the behavior of these models as we change different parameters in understanding how certain tipping points, like where the system will have an outbreak, depend on parameter values in general, not just the specific values we have, but as a formula to characterize how much it depends on parameter values. These models, as we saw yesterday with particle filtering and particle MCMC, can be very readily combined with machine learning, with those techniques, with Kalman filtering, etc. And we have many publications on this using stock and flow models from system dynamics together with variously Kalman filtering, particle filtering, and particle MCMC, particularly, with the latter two being where we spent most of our time. For those interested, also with MCMC, but that's addressing a different question. But they can be very readily used with MCMC. I will say, for use with Kalman filtering, particle filtering, and PMCMC, there needs to be some measure of stochastics in the model. So, what are some notable strengths of system dynamics? Well, stock and flow models capture, in a very transparent, for low levels of heterogeneity, in a very expressive, and a very visually powerful, like supporting visual reasoning about the model. They support the ability to characterize dynamics of continuous variables. I'm saying continuous variables like the count of susceptibles, the count of infections, the count of exposed. But it could be, for example, my level of viral load, or my level of immune activation against a pathogen, or my level of immune protection, memory of that pathogen. My T cell levels, or my antibody levels. It could be the level of fentanyl in my body. It could be, something about my blood glucose level, my insulin level. When we have continuous variables, whether it's at an individual level or at a population level, perception of risk from COVID-19, maybe you posit that applies to a segment of the population. You treat that as a continuous variable. You can very easily couch a theory of governing how this is governed, often in a stock and flow model. This technique supports very rapid modeling prototyping. It's very quick to put together a simple model that characterizes many situations, not all. If the heart of your problem lies in network effects and understanding phenomena over networks, you're going to have a harder time with it. Characterizing a process that operates over networks, like contact tracing, to the degree you can approach it with such models, it requires a great deal of fortitude. It provides support for participatory modeling that's really rich. System dynamics does. These sorts of stock flow models are provably, I mean, there's a long history of it, provably accessible to community members. You can have dialogue about these sorts of models in the course of a day with people who've never seen them before, who've never had any training in modeling, and have not graduated high school. They are approachable with some bits of explanation. You can have those people challenge you, make suggestions about the model, question it, critique it, work to improve it, work to sharpen it. And in a world where we're seeking to address complex health challenges, including things like behavioral evasion for rules for, antibiotic prescriptions or what have you, for applying antibiotic prescriptions in a veterinary context or what have you, like understanding people's perceptions in the trenches and having a representation that's a straw dog representation that they can help challenge, or where an infectious disease physician can help challenge and say you need a representation of asymptomatic individuals, and you need to distinguish asymptomatic individuals from oligosymptomatic. That's really valuable. So having a model form that's accessible, that is understandable, that can be challenged is part of using modeling for learning. It requires a degree of willingness to be vulnerable, but that's how we learn. We're vulnerable. We try, we fail early, fail often. We open ourselves to that and we benefit from it. We're the stronger from it. System dynamics, whether it's stock and flow models or whether it's causal loop diagrams. And forgive me for not having a larger diagram here to show you. I should have shown you, because you can build causal loop diagrams readily that are readily approachable with dozens of variables, including some that are rather qualitative, like level of stigma or level of fear or level stress levels or concern about reputation or what have you. Those can be variables in these diagrams. And it can let you have dialogues, even if you don't commit to having them in your quantitative model, lets you have dialogues to really let you understand a lot of the key drivers for a situation. And then you can figure out which of these you actually want to embrace in a way that puts them into a model. And what I want to emphasize is that this can be done in a way that is declarative throughout. You're not showing them code. You're not showing them, looping over variables. You're showing them something that's visually parsable. And more than that, where you can reason about it in terms of its visual behavior. If you have observations from the world of, the number of people in the emergency room at any one time has been rising over recent years, you can talk about a diagram that shows people coming in and people leaving, some leaving without being seen, some being admitted to the hospital wards, some leaving after the initial physician initial assessment, some being counseled by addictions medicine specialist and then be admitted directly. You can have dialogues about this and about why it's rising that take into account, like, okay, the inflow is greater than the outflow. And they don't have to see equations. They don't have to see that this is a stochastic formulation based on a Poisson arrival or what have you. They don't have to see the formula. They can just understand these guidelines. It's a very powerful way of understanding people's perceptions of the situation, understanding the lived reality on the ground that they're living with, and understanding the degree to which your theory jives with that, and welcoming their challenges to your understanding of how things work. With formal reasoning, with formal analysis, this can be extraordinarily powerful. We can understand, as Nastran has implemented, based on past work by Christian Campman and others, which feedback loops dominate at any one time as a model evolves, as a quantitative model evolves, as a stock and flow model evolves. We can reason about sensitivity at any one time to parameter values, what's called eigenvalue elasticity or eigenvalue sensitivity. We can understand which mechanisms within this model are driving behavior at any one point. To what degree is it being driven by recovery as compared to spread of infection? If we had a model of contact tracing, to what degree is that driving some of the dynamics seen in terms of number of new cases being reported, et cetera. And the strong support for intuition building. So system dynamics is a very varied tradition. It uses causal loop diagrams to capture semi-qualitative understanding. I say semi because we can associate with these archetypical behaviors and reason in a sort of rough way about behavior from a depiction of the system, even with very, very hard to quantify variables. And then we can dive in with quantitative models and depict aspects visually accessible in a visually accessible way that can help us reason about the dynamics over time in a more quantitative way, while still having it be formally analyzable. But where system dynamics breaks down, it tends to be not as good a fit. We'll talk about a bit later, but it includes things like when you have network effects prominent, or when you want to take into account an individual's history, say, of traumatic events or of adverse childhood experiences or other presentations as clinic and how that might shape their experience now, or where you want to accumulate information about it. You want to take into account their location in space or their connections to others or multiple levels of contact, their connection with family and their school environment and the higher level environment. It tends not to be nearly as effective in those sort of areas, and we'll comment a little bit more about that later. So this is system dynamics. Maybe before I continue with that, I'm mindful of the time. Are there any questions people want to bring forward about system dynamics? This would be a really good time to talk about, that tradition, in recognizing I've given a capsule summary of a very rich tradition. Are there any questions people want to bring forward? Still seeing somehow a disembodied hand at the bottom, but I'm not seeing any hands raised by participants. Going once, going twice. Okay, if not, before we break for lunch, I'm gonna see if I can handle the second tradition, discrete event modeling. Maybe I'll stop my comments here.